Okay, welcome back. And we're going to finish up our discussion of the First Amendment. The second part, we're going to focus on military and sort of national security issues and both speaking out against the military, the press coverage of war and military events, classified documents, a lot of interesting elements of how the military comes into play, and specifically looking at how do you balance citizens' rights to freedom of speech and freedom of the press with national security and really global security. So, a lot of interesting cases to come out of this, and let's jump right in. The first thing we're going to talk about is something called prior restraint. And prior restraint is essentially the doctrine that says sometimes something is such grave danger, typically to national security, that the government will ask the courts to actually block something before it's even come out. So, in other words, there's two things you can do. Let's say, well, we're going to talk about a case in a minute with the New York Times wanting to publish some classified documents. So there's two ways that the government could handle that. They could just stand back, let the New York Times publish them, and then go after them, sue them, and punish them after the fact. Or they can go to the courts and ask for redress under something called prior restraint, which is to say, letting them publish them is so dangerous and such a grave risk. We want the court to issue an injunction, a restraining order to step in and block it before it even happens. Courts are very hesitant to do this. Almost all prior restraints have been declared unconstitutional, again, except in matters of national security. Now, the problem with that is it's led the government oftentimes to pigeonhole in cases and claim national security where it's really not always there. And again, New York Times, so I want to talk about a very, very famous case. It's colloquially called the Pentagon Papers. It's a case from 1971. It's the New York Times Company v. the United States of America. And the case centered around the idea that the New York Times and also the Washington Post had a large number of classified documents about the Vietnam War and specifically, just a lot of inside information, if you will, about how the government strategized and what happened in Vietnam. Now, the government, of course, did not want this information published. They sued and attempted to block it under the idea that it was a risk to national security. And that case ultimately was decided in favor of the New York Times and ultimately the Washington Post as well. And in the ruling, they talked about the court said we've got a heavy presumption against prior restraint. In other words, we automatically lean against it. You've got to prove otherwise. So think back to our seven interpretations of the First Amendment and sort of think about which one you think that might align with. So in that case, it was a huge pivotal case that again has been used as precedent setting going forward. You've got to really prove there's legitimate national security danger versus in this case maybe the United States government faced being embarrassed by what was in the papers, or maybe it might make individual people look bad, or it might anger the public about some of the policies, and all of that didn't meet that threshold of a true national security issue. Let's look at another one though, where sometimes prior restraint um, is allowed, or at least it's addressed. I wouldn't say it's allowed because it's not exactly a prior restraint case, but it's an important case. Schneck versus United States, 1919. Charles Schneck was a self-proclaimed socialist, anti-war person, and what he was doing was essentially distributing leaflets. He was printing and distributing leaflets that were trying to convince people. His argument was that the draft was a violation of the 13th Amendment, and he thought folks should peaceably, but they should abstain from um, participating in the draft. They basically should refuse the draft. So the United States arrested him, charged him with violating the Espionage Act. Case went to court, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, it's not exactly prior restraint because he actually did distribute them, but I share this case because I think it's important how the court did rule because it does relate to the national security question. And in a 9-0 unanimous decision, the Supreme Court came down and they said, during wartime, we're going to defer to the government. There's going to be deference to the government, almost kind of a better safe than sorry approach to it, because again, folks were at risk. Now, one thing that came out of this ruling was the very famous, what became known as the clear and present danger test. And the idea was, and this was the accepted matters of national security, the court basically said if the speech has the potential to cause a clear and present danger, uh, then that may be reason to, to block it. And so, even though this case does not, it was not prior restraint because he had already distributed them, this would be used going forward as an example of prior restraint cases to make the argument down the road. So that idea of the clear and present danger test would be used in many, many cases in the years to come, where the government would say, listen, releasing this information will create a clear and present danger. So even though the case itself was not prior restraint, it set up precedent for how it would be argued down the road. And so again, 9-0, the court ruled in favor of the government in that case. Now, let's look, moving on, denial of access to locations. Now, this is very interesting. As you can imagine, and going back to the Pentagon Papers, the government historically in the United States has been very guarded about war. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about them wanting to sanitize war. Um, you know, War is unpleasant, right? That's kind of stating the obvious, but you take like something during Vietnam where thousands and thousands of, young kids, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids were being sent over, drafted and sent over, and many, many, many of them died. Um, there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War, and so the government essentially didn't want all of that necessarily reported. But in the beginning, at least, the press had more freedom than ever before. They had a lot of coverage of Vietnam. And what happened, we also saw huge anti-war protests and constant, I mean, throughout the entire Vietnam War era, there was massive upheaval and protests across the country. And part of that certainly was because of the press reports, right? The film footage, the photographs showing really horrific things happening. Because again, if you were in the United States, you don't really know what's happening on the other side of the world, except that the press was bringing that information back. Now, fundamentally, that's the core of the First Amendment, right? That's what we need, a free and open press. But the government didn't like it. They thought it was bad. It was bad for morale. It was a bad look for the military. And so lots of times that's pushed back against. So when you compare Vietnam, fast forward ahead to 1991, the Gulf War, only 200 members of the press were allowed to cover 500,000 American troops. So imagine that, how limiting that's going to be, how limited the coverage is. Now, the other interesting thing about that is when you have such a limited number of people given access, not saying this happens, but it's a concern that people worry will happen, and that is the press might be less likely to report really bad things because they don't want to lose their access to be able to cover whatever it is they're covering. So one of the concerns is by limiting the number of press that you're allowed to cover it, you possibly are discouraging the press from, reporting stories that are not going to reflect well on the United States. Right? So just another concern. Now today, a lot has changed again, and you see a lot more access. With between the massive expansion in cable news, social media, online media platforms. There's a lot more access today, but still we're seeing some pushback um, against the press coverage in many, many instances. Now, kind of the ultimate coverage is embedding, right? So embedding is when members of the press actually are with the military, direct in battle on the front lines, going along with them and covering it literally on the ground. So, if there's a firefight happening or there's a bombing or there's any kind of combat situation, they are right there to report it virtually in real time, right? Or certainly from a very, very first-hand experience. Again, a lot of the military doesn't like that because it doesn't always look good. They can't sort of filter things. If you're a member of the press and you see it with your own eyes, there's no chance for the military to the Pentagon to put any kind of spin on what happened. So it's a tricky balance. A lot of folks don't like the embedded troops, but again, in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, they give the American public and the world public the greatest chance to see what's actually happening in these war zones and in these battles. Very important case that came out in 2004, Flint v. Rumsfeld. Larry Flint was the publisher of a magazine called Hustler Magazine. Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense at the time. And Flint argued essentially he wanted to embed with troops in overseas during the conflict in Afghanistan. And the government basically said, no, it's kind of a long, complicated case, but ultimately they said, we're going to give you access to different things, but no, you can't embed right now. So Flint sued, he lost, and then he took it to the federal appellate court, and in 2004 he lost again. And this is a very important ruling because the appellate court said, quote, there is no constitutionally based right for the media to embed with U.S. military forces in combat, essentially saying it's at the discretion of the military, but that you don't have, it's not abridging the press, the freedom of the press, to not let you be in combat with us. That's a very, very important case because think about that. Think about how you interpret that. Do you think that's fair? Because you might argue that it allows the military to control the messaging. That if there's going to be some sort of mission or battle or fight where maybe they don't want people to see what they're doing. Again, this is what critics would argue, that they're going to shield the press, keep the press out so that maybe they don't have the accountability that they otherwise would. So again, just something for you to think about. Do you think that's a good ruling? Or do you think that under that First Amendment, that denying access to embed with the troops is in fact abridging the freedom of the press? Just, again, something for you to think about. Kind of similar to some of this tension, this back and forth, is denial of access to documents and photographs. Now, there's something called, you've probably heard the phrase, a FOIA Act, the Freedom of Information Act. So you'll hear people say, well, they submitted a FOIA request. And basically, it creates the right to access records kept by federal government agencies. So if there's really technically any document kept at the federal level, if you want to see it, you have the right to file a FOIA request. Now, it sounds great. It sounds like you'll then get to see things and there'll be transparency. But the actual truth is, a lot of times those FOIA requests get denied. They will either get outright denied, or you may get the information, but it may be heavily redacted. And again, as with the earlier matters that we talked about, the government is going to fall back on exceptions for matters of national security. Okay, so obviously, in terms of talking about redacted documents, in 2025, 2026, it's very relevant to talk about the Jeffrey Epstein files, where the government has possession of all of those records, but they are redacting them, in this case, not for national security. More, there's exceptions carved out to protect the rights of children, and some other examples of why you're allowed to redact things, as is often debated, and certainly in the Epstein case. Sometimes it's argued the government takes advantage of that and redacts much more than they need to. And again, hotly debated in the courts. But when we talk about Freedom of Information Acts, there's lots of examples where people filing FOIA requests have uncovered huge things. A few years back, Flint, Michigan, there was a problem with the water, and it's sort of a long story of what the government did. But essentially, the end result was people in the poorest communities in Flint, Michigan, were being poisoned by lead in the water, and the government knew it and ultimately didn't really fix the problem. And through a FOIA request, all kinds of internal documents were released that proved that the local government did know what was going on, knew well in advance, and didn't take steps to protect the citizens. That's just one example where FOIA, it does give regular folks, if you will, a chance to push back and to get access and to get transparency with the government. So just again, another element, um, and that can go for documents, that can go for photographs, that can go for videos. Really, any of that kind of information, any of those records kept by government agencies at any level. By the way, you can do FOIA requests at the most basic local level, towns, school boards, any government agency, all the way up to regional, state, and federal level. Um, let's see. Other wartime censorship. This is an interesting one. Again, we talk about freedom of the press, but there are times where there are punishments for publishing that national security information. So we saw with New York Times Company v. United States, the Pentagon Papers, that the court said, it's not really national security. Again, might not be flattering, might not be favorable for the government, but there's not true risk of national security. Now, on the other side, we could look at Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks. You've probably heard of WikiLeaks. And essentially, WikiLeaks, that's what their business was, right? They had sources and they had people primarily collecting classified information, leaking it to them. And then through a variety of means and sources, WikiLeaks would publish that classified information. Now, in that case, lots of it had huge national security implications. They were at different times publishing information that showed positions of U.S. troops overseas, which obviously puts them potentially in imminent danger of attack. They would release, just various plans, war plans, strategies, all kinds of security issues that absolutely had big ramifications for national security. So in that case, and Julian Assange has a long, complicated, and twisted process through the legal system, but in a variety of ways, he got in trouble for things. But in 2024, he actually was uh, convicted of conspiring to receive and disseminate classified information. He had already been in jail for a long time for other things, and so he was sentenced to time served. But most importantly, he was sentenced, so he was found guilty and punished for publishing information because it was a risk for national security. Okay, so that's kind of an important case and a watershed case that people look at for what he did. Now, Assange is considered by many people to be a hero, right? Because he's, if you're on that side, you think that he is keeping the government honest, exposing corruption, sort of leveling the playing field. If you have a son or a daughter who's overseas in a war zone and suddenly their position is being leaked and they're put in greater danger, you might take a different position on what you think about WikiLeaks. But nonetheless, a very interesting example of punishing the press for publishing things that are classified. And the last one I want to touch on is self censorship by the news media. Um, a lot of things the media can do legally, they choose not to do. So if you watch the evening news or go to CNN online or any number of media outlets, you're going to see a lot of stuff. But generally, most of the time, you're not going to see. They'll cover murders and they'll cover accidents and all kinds of terrible things, and they very rarely will show a dead body. Now, it's not illegal for the most part. There's a few exceptions. It's not illegal for them to show an image of a dead body, but they just self-censor. They choose not to. Now, there are some exceptions with the right to privacy for families and things like that. But for the most part, if they wanted to, they could, but they self-censor and they don't. And there's lots of other examples. A big one would be um, for the most part, most of the time, most mainstream media will not publish the name or the image of anybody who is alleged to be a victim of a sexual assault. Right? They don't put their name and they won't put their picture for obvious reasons. But again, lots of times there's not laws that say they can't do that. They are simply self-censoring, whether it's good taste, whether it's they have a sense of what the public wants versus what they don't want. But again, it's something they do on their own. And when we take it back and tie it into the war, this is a huge deal because, again, pictures coming back from Vietnam. You know, dead Americans is not good for national morale. It's not good for the war effort when you're trying to build support and momentum for the war. Can be really, really damaging. So some media covered it more than others, and some engaged in that self-censorship. Um, one other, I don't have a slide on it, but one other thing that I think is really important when we talk about this tension between the press wanting to cover and the government not always wanting to cover war. Really, really important ones. If we go back to 1991, 91, 92, 1991, the United States is engaged in the Gulf War. In 1991, the president is George H.W. Bush, and American soldiers are dying. And when they die, there's a process of how those bodies are returned back to America. And they come back to a military air base in Delaware, in Dover, Delaware. And, the caskets are wrapped in American flags and they are brought off by dress uniformed soldiers and they are given a proper, respectful return home, if you will. And in 1991, George H.W. Bush, president, outlawed the press to cover the casket returns. Why? Bad optics for the government. They didn't want photos splashed across newspapers, and they didn't want footage on television and the evening news of casket after casket after casket coming off those planes. Because again, it's just the public didn't have a stomach for it, and they knew that American sentiment would turn against the war. So the debate is that, that's the government. Are they abridging the freedom of the press or are they not? Right? So that's debatable. That stayed in place until 2009. President Obama lifted that and allowed coverage. So today, you will see coverage videos, photos taken from Dover, Delaware, from the Air Force Base when American troops return home having died in battle. So I want you to think about that again, because again, these answers aren't black and white. There's a lot of gray when we're talking about the First Amendment. So I want you to think, was it the government suppressing the freedom of the press by not allowing them to cover that, which is fine if that's your position? Or is your position that it's an airbase? The government has a right to decide who they allow on there and who they don't, and they choose not to have those events covered. Now, again, part of the argument, the government was not going to say, hey, this is bad optics for us. What they were saying is we want to respect the families and respect their privacy, and we don't want to, have their loved ones, even though they're obviously anonymous coming off in caskets. We don't want them to be filmed and photographed and put out there that it's too painful for the family. So where do you come down on that? Give that some thought and decide what position you take on that, or maybe somewhere in between. But just another interesting element of wartime censorship and sort of how, again, there's steady and constant back and forth between the government and between the press. And as the press has grown to the point where now, you know, everybody is the press, right? Um, bloggers, independent journalists, podcasts, all the mainstream media. There's just so much more media covering things than ever before in history that these issues are going to continue to press and press and press. And especially as we see a lot more tension maybe today between the government and the citizenry, especially as we see, things happening in Venezuela, things happening really in our own country. And there's a lot of suspicion against the government, and there's a lot of pushback and a lot of back and forth. So interesting things to think about and issues that are not going away anytime soon. So that is it for this presentation, and I will talk to you soon.